All right. Well, thank you all for joining me here today. My name is Quatez Scott, and I am the intercultural specialist who oversees the Belinga Black Cultural Resources Center. And I'm excited to have this important conversation, which is a part of Wright State University's recognition and celebration, or really the exhibit of UnDesign, the Red Line. A lot of great topical conversations that are taking place with some different speakers. Me today specifically. We had the opportunity to watch White Flight and Redlining, which was a documentary. And I'm just going to merely pull out some of the main concepts that came out of that, and things that folks like should definitely be aware of, especially as we continue to see some of the lingering effects of not only redlining, but white flight in our society today. So, some of the important conversations, concepts to keep in mind. Basically, when we're talking about redlining, so some of the core things to keep in mind, not just with redlining in and of itself, but what it leads to racial segregation, which is the degree to which two or more groups live separately from one another in different parts of the urban environment. And when we talk about these groups, we're talking about racial groups. So it's the degree to which white people live separate from black people live separate from the Latinx community, the Latinx community living separate from Asian Americans, so on and so forth, and however you want to combine essentially what that is. Um, but today's conversation specifically is focusing on white flight. So the definition of white flight that came out of this book, which I highly recommend for folks, is White Space, Black Hood. This is a book that recently came out last year, which goes into redlining in and of itself, but also too what segregation in America looks like, really in some of the most historically segregated communities, but then also too just what it looks like on the whole in America. So white flight is the general desire to avoid black people and urban communities. So when we talk about the general desire, that is very much intentional. So it's the actual actions that are taking place in which white people are consciously segregating and separating themselves from people of color, particularly black people. So this largely began in the 1960s, as we saw inside of that documentary. With the Great Migration that took place in the mid 20th century, we saw a lot of jobs being had and being developed up in northern cities. And with that, brought a lot of black people from the South up to the North. As black people then began to integrate themselves in communities, not only were they redlined in terms of you had the Fair Housing Act and all these other different policies that were put in place that denied black people opportunities to live in a lot of those communities. There were some black people who did ultimately gain access to a lot of those more affluent communities. So this is where we come into de jure versus de facto segregation. So prior to a lot of the policies and the laws that or that prohibited white people from legally segregating themselves from black people and people of color, i.e., redlining, there was de jure segregation, which is a form of segregation that was protected by law. The Color of Law is a great book for folks who would like to go ahead and read that. I would highly encourage everyone to read that. You really become aware of just how deep the issue of not only just segregation but racism in America really is, and how a lot of it was really protected by law, and how a lot of laws are still in place today that protect a lot of racism today. But you have de jure segregation, but then what happens when those laws are then outlawed, which is an anti-racist practice, right? To then outlaw something that continues to perpetuate racism, is then you have what's called de facto segregation, which is when it's no longer legalized, but then people make conscious choices to do things that still lead to the same outcome. So de facto segregation was segregation which was upheld by unwritten customs and tradition. You could argue that it became a custom and a tradition as we saw the trends of as more and more people of color began to not only move into white communities, but somewhat close to white communities, more and more white people fled and they took their families with them. So that is essentially the basis of what white flight looked like in the 20th century in America. There's a really great excerpt that came out of that particular book, but what they talk about is racial steering. So racial steering, and where you talk about white white flight folks in the white community that ended up not only leaving those communities, but having to look at what they took with them. When you look at most definitions of racism in America, typically what people say is that it's prejudice plus power more often than not. And what we see in research and what we see when you look at statistics and when you look at outcomes within our society, white people largely control a lot of social wealth, educational attainment, as well as health outcomes as well. So when you look at that, there's a lot of power that comes within white communities. So as white families and as white individuals leave those communities, they take a lot of that socioeconomic power with them, which deprives then those communities of color who often rely on the folks who make those dollars, who are contributing tax wise to the public services that are often rendered as a result of the folks who are making that money. So they take those things with them, as well as the people that are oftentimes doing that work, right? So racial steering in racial or real estate markets, discrimination in mortgage lending, exclusionary zoning, a government subsidized affordable housing industrial complex that concentrates poverty, local school boundaries that encourage segregation, plus continued resistance to integration by many, but not all whites, all contribute to enduring segregation. All these practices also happen to produce profits and enormous wealth for a small cadre of mainly white investors, institutions, and corporations. So essentially, as white folks continue to flee these communities, um, what largely happened was, again, it left the consequences of people of color that had fewer and fewer of those resources. And as we see within research, the fewer opportunities that folks have in terms of gaining access to education, health, wealth, the more likely it is that those same effects are going to be passed down from generation to generation. So this gets into the concept of opportunity hoarding, right? So when you are in control of something, most times people want to protect that, but it comes at the overprotection or the protection of certain resources often comes at the expense of those communities that have already been historically and generationally disadvantaged, and it continues to perpetuate ultimately that cycle. Are there any questions about that thus far before we move on? Nope. All right. So, one of the other concepts that I think of, and in my work in anti-racism, one of the things that comes up oftentimes is the word resistance. And for me personally, I think of white flight as a form of resistance, but it's a resistance to racial equity. So, as we saw, or in racial equality, again, as we saw with during the Great Migration, keeping in mind that a lot of the families that were down in the South, as with the Great Migration moving to the North, why were they moving to the North? For jobs. There was already a lot of job insecurity that was taking place in the South. A lot of Black people living off of the land, which a lot of Black people did not have land, or at least healthy land, to live off of. So what took place was, as jobs began to boom in the North, Black people began to move up north where the jobs were. As we see, as a consequence of that, or as a response to that, we then see white families that began moving out of those very neighborhoods as a way of continuing to move away and segregate and separate themselves from Black people and Black families. So one of the most common responses to anti-racist events and efforts is resistance, and this is noted by a lot of anti-racist educators and theorists. One of my favorite terms comes from Carol Anderson. She writes in this book called White Rage, she introduces the concept of white rage, which is she defines as the rebellion-like resistance to Black advancement by white people. She gives this very, very thorough history of a lot of significant moments in American history, particularly where a lot of progress was being made by Black people, and then the response was by white people to either situations like this where we flee communities or where we do roundabout ways of continuing to perpetuate racism, whether or not it was de jure or it was de facto, right? So here you see on these signs, you have families, white women in particular in this visual that were literally standing out protesting integration and equity and protecting the rights that they believed that they had. It goes to the idea of whiteness as property that a lot of other authors and scholars are writing about now and have been writing about for some time. Whiteness as property is this idea. Again, it's an idea. It doesn't mean that it's true, but it's this idea that a lot of those resources that white people are in possession of naturally belong to white people, which then causes them to protect their assets. Again, this comes at the expense of people of color, which then becomes a very dehumanizing act. So, again, moving on with that, like one of the aims of producing and reproducing racism is the maintenance of power, i.e., white flight. How do we, the question then becomes, as white people during that period of time, I would imagine, is how do we protect the assets that we have, the power that we have, and how do we make sure that other folks, i.e., people of color, i.e., black people, they don't get access to this? So again, a lot of white rage or anti-black racism took place as a response to black people migrating from the South up to the North. So the effects of white flight today, some of these things came out in the documentary, but some of these are also just some statistics, some staggering statistics that I've come across that are pretty alarming today. And one of them was, so redlining took place. It started in the late 1920s and in the 1930s as a way of banks literally denying black people and other people of color loans and mortgages, or they put very strict penalties for defaulting on those loans. So the loans that they ultimately did give to lend to black people and other people of color typically had huge penalties on them that were not often given to their white counterparts, which again is what a very racist act to do. So even today, roughly 75% of neighborhoods in this entire country that were redlined as early as the 1930s are still the most economically disadvantaged communities today. We're talking about almost a century later, and a policy that took place almost 100 years ago is still having the same impact as it was intended to do, even worse, actually, because now we see the addition of, and what's also stated inside of or what's reviewed inside of the documentary is the booming of opioids and opioid addiction, and how it's a persistent and prevalent issue in the most economically disadvantaged communities, oftentimes. And economically disadvantaged communities also affect white people as well. So that's one of the things that's important to understand about redlining, is that there are white people that are also poor white people that also are a part of the equation as well, but overly represented within those communities is typically people of color. So then now what was stated inside of the documentary was that as of 2010, I believe, or 2011, in Ohio, in the state of Ohio, opioid prescriptions rose by over 1,000%. So, when you start looking at opioid addiction, and then you start looking in the community in economically disadvantaged communities, we then start to see that some of the biggest communities that this has impacted are communities of color. And then, of course, there's a whole nother conversation that can be had in which now we look at opioid addictions as a human health issue, whereas when it was largely focused on black communities, it was more of, the stereotyping, the stigma behind black people just being drug addicts, versus now this is a human health crisis. And that's a whole nother conversation in and of itself that I would encourage folks to look at. Some of the other issues is the concept of dissimilarity. So dissimilarity is the measure of segregation. So like what would it take ultimately for all things to be equal between racial groups? So as we see, whites are oftentimes the most hyper segregated communities, meaning that within white communities, it's basically like how many houses you could go before you ultimately see a house of color, or a house that holds people of color inside of it, or that's owned by people of color. So white people are oftentimes the most hyper segregated communities that we see. So the similarity then measures segregation between two racial groups. So within white to black, the similarity fell from 78% as of 1970 to about 60%, which even though that means that 60% today, 60% of black people would then need to move in order to be more, I guess, to be more closer to white people, if that makes any sense. Like to be more, to be for I guess like there not to be as big of a segregation issue. 60% of black people would then need to move, which is still a very, very high number. That's more than half of black people that live within this country. For Latinx individuals, it fell and it still sits at 49%, which is still considered moderate. And then for Asian Americans, that's about 40%. So while you still see Latinx individuals as well as the Asian American community sitting at less than half, it's still a very, very, very prevalent issue in terms of how white people are literally closing off their neighborhoods from people of color. And then, of course, the demographic that's not represented within there is the indigenous people population, which the book White Space Black Hood notes is that that is one of the most invisible communities for a multitude of reasons, but they recognize that that was a community that was not necessarily represented within this information. Other things to keep in mind is that half of Black metropolitan residents, or what folks tend to say are Black folks that live in urban communities, excuse me, live in segregated neighborhoods, and the descendants of slavery tend to be more segregated than their Black immigrant counterparts. So when you look at this, that's part of intersectionality. You have Black folks that are domestic, and then you have Black folks that are immigrants to the country. More times than not, when you look at racially segregated communities and some of the most disadvantaged communities that exist today, more than half of those still are folks that are coming from communities in which, or coming from lines, generational lines, where chattel slavery was very much a part of that family's history. So, although we look at slavery as an issue of the past, it very much still shows up in our present society here today. And then by 2010, and I just wanted to pull this out because this is a staggering statistic in and of itself, but by 2010, unemployment in Dayton, Ohio topped 12%, which, sometimes folks can look at, it's one thing to look at unemployment, which is it's 12% is bad in and of itself, but we also have to look at another issue, which is then the average family income. The average family income for most households in Dayton, Ohio is $32,540. That does not take into consideration how big the average family home is. But also at the same time, the federal government sets the poverty line, right? The poverty line by the federal government is set at, I believe, around $24,000. So now we're looking at folks that make roughly $8,000 more than that. And you're looking at a lot of folks who have children, they have spouses, and then we're looking at the bills that need to be paid as well. And then now you have folks that have to pick and choose between what it is that they spend their money on. So when you look at that in and of itself, and it points as you go into that within the documentary in and of itself, you have a lot of families that have to make a lot of hard decisions. Part of the struggle with that is that in Dayton communities, and a lot of Dayton communities, there aren't any grocery stores. There are fewer and fewer families have access to fresh food, which means that, of course, it becomes a health crisis, not just because of the limitation on what they're able to eat, but then also too on what the things that they are actually eating, what is then doing to the physical body. So that is another thing that has become a huge, huge issue when it comes to white flight. So that's essentially what I have today. Um, and I guess I'm going to ask some questions. Ravon, I don't know if you're looking to do that intentionally, but it says you're trying to gain remote control of my computer. I don't think I can do that.
I just wanted to say, as you were talking about that white rage, I remember when my parents moved to a particular part of town here in Dayton when I was like in first grade, and it was a white community, predominantly white community, and um, they didn't have signs, but they were like. Uh, uh, Definitely opposed to us moving into um, to the neighborhood. And when we moved, they actually like all the people were outside, standing in their yard on their fences, clapping, and I was like, "Oh my gosh!" So yeah, we stayed there. I guess till my parents were renting, and so we stayed there for the year that the lease was up. Then we were out. But yeah, so that was quite the experience, if you will.
Yeah,
Especially at first grade, you don't even understand what it is, what's going on, But it was not good.
yeah. No, sorry, like I was like halfway listening to that, but I don't know who that person was, but they kept trying to like gain access.
Oh,
So I was having to like remove them like from it because I kept like denying it and then they kept like doing
oh wow, okay,
it. So thank you for your patience with that. Um,
no problem.
yeah, yeah. So are you about to leave now?
Yeah, here, yeah, in a couple minutes.
All right.
But
So
yeah, it was just unreal. I mean, and I didn't even go into all the different things that we experienced, especially walking back and forth to school, what that was like being at school and all that kind of stuff. N- not feeling welcomed in that neighborhood, in that community, in that school. But yeah.
yeah, I one of the things that I liked as I've been reading this book and reading some other things as well is like even that whole concept of like ghetto and how it's actually misrepresented because oftentimes we associate the word ghetto with black people, but if you actually look at the terminology in and of itself, um, he says ghetto is defined by many sociologists as areas that are concentrated by poverty. It's not necessarily about race. So when you look at concentrated pieces like the intentional piece of it, but when you look at poverty, you see a lot of like country like white people that are also like very, very much like impoverished. So like those are
Yep.
also ghettos. It's just a ghetto that racially looks different. But it's also interesting to see like the ideas that we talk about, like versus country people versus like black people versus Latinx people. Um, the embracing of it is like different too, right? You know, people love to see flannel and like all this other stuff, but if you see a person, a black person with like a tank top, like a white beater or whatever, like, oh, then that's like a person that was in jail or like whatever else, it's like the ideas and stuff that come behind those things are really interesting.
Right. Well, it was great, but I need to run to another meeting. So thank you so much. It was a great presentation. I'm glad you recorded it so I can go back and
Yeah,
listen
no
to it.
problem. All right. Well,
Okay.
thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
All right.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye.
And yeah, no problem. And then to the folks who are still here some of the other questions that we have available for you all, at least to consider. So the first question is, would you consider white flight to be a form of racism? Why or why not? How and in what ways? How and in what ways can not was can white flight impact the schooling experiences of children of color? And then what can we continue to do to combat white flight and its consequences on communities of color? So one of the reasons why we have, or I inserted the word continue, is that there are some initiatives that are taking place to combat white flight. And this is also acknowledging that there are white anti-racist folks that are engaging in different efforts to combat white flight as well. So what are some things that can continue to take place in order to do that? Those are some great things to keep in mind. So, again, my name is Quatez Scott. There are no other questions that are here, but my name is Quatez Scott. I am the intercultural specialist of the Belinga Black Cultural Resources Center. You can feel free to email me at quatez.scott@right.edu. And if you have any questions about anything in particular, you would like to get into contact with me to talk about this particular documentary, please feel free to do so. And I also encourage all of you to visit the UnDesign, the Redline exhibit, which is taking place in the Paul Laurence Dunbar Library here on campus on the second floor. Thank you all so much. Take care, and I look forward to talking with you soon. Bye-bye.